The moment I realized my parents expected me to put my entire life on hold for their dogs instead of chasing the future I had worked so hard to earn, I understood that saying yes one more time would cost me far more than saying no ever could. My name is Emily Carter, and until that morning, I believed being a good daughter meant making everyone else's needs more important than my own. Looking back now, I realize I spent years confusing love with obligation. The call came just as I reached the departure gate at John Glenn Columbus International Airport. Travelers hurried past me, rolling suitcases over polished floors while boarding announcements echoed through the terminal. I held my phone in one hand and my boarding pass in the other, smiling to myself because after nearly 8 years of long hours, weekend shifts, and more sacrifices than I could count, I had finally earned an opportunity that could change my career. My company was sending me to Seattle for a leadership program. If everything went well, a promotion would almost certainly follow. I had packed carefully the night before, checked my flight twice, and even arrived early because I refused to let anything interfere with this chance. Then my phone rang. Mom flashed across the screen. I answered immediately because I assumed something terrible had happened. My parents were both in their 60s, and lately every unexpected call made my heart race. "Emily," my mother said, sounding strangely annoyed instead of frightened, "where are you?" "At the airport," I replied. "My flight boards in about 20 minutes. There was a pause. Then she sighed. "You need to come home." He stopped walking. "Is Dad all right?" "Your father is fine. Are you okay?" "We are both perfectly fine." Relief washed over me for only a second before confusion settled in. "Then what happened?" "We forgot to tell you we are leaving for the lake this afternoon," she said matter-of-factly. "Someone has to stay with Bailey, Charlie, and Daisy." He stared through the terminal windows at the airplane waiting outside. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. "Mom," I said quietly, "my flight leaves in less than half an hour." "Flights can be changed," she answered. "The dogs cannot stay alone for several days." Around me, families hugged goodbye, business travelers checked their watches, and children pointed excitedly toward the planes outside. Everything continued as though the world made perfect sense. Yet my own felt strangely upside down. She was asking me to cancel the most important professional opportunity of my life because my parents had scheduled a vacation without arranging care for 3 healthy dogs. The surprising part was not the request itself. The surprising part was that she sounded completely certain I would agree. That confidence did not appear overnight. It had been built over years of my saying yes. Just when they wanted a weekend away. Just when they decided to visit friends at the last minute. Just when they planned holiday trips before asking whether I was available. Somehow my calendar had slowly become an extension of theirs. He looked down at my suitcase, then back at the boarding gate where passengers had already begun lining up. For the first time in my adult life, I did not answer immediately. He simply stood there listening to my mother's breathing on the other end of the phone, realizing that the next word I spoke would determine far more than whether I boarded that airplane. It would decide whether my future still belonged to me. My mother did not fill the silence. She waited because waiting had always worked before. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the boarding announcement echo through the terminal. Passengers stepped into line with coffee cups, backpacks, and quiet conversations. A little girl laughed as she pulled a bright pink suitcase behind her father. Everyone around me was moving toward somewhere new while I stood perfectly still, trapped between the future I had earned and a responsibility that had somehow become mine without anyone ever asking if I wanted it. "Emily," my mother finally said. "Are you still there?" "I am here," I answered softly. "I just need a minute." She sighed again, this time with unmistakable impatience. "You know those dogs cannot be left alone." Bailey gets anxious. Charlie refuses to eat if strangers come into the house. Daisy needs her medication every evening. He knew every detail because I had been the one giving that medication whenever my parents decided to take spontaneous trips. He knew exactly which toy Bailey slept beside. He knew Charlie would only eat after someone sat with him for a few minutes. He even knew the rat Daisy preferred during her evening walks around their neighborhood. Those routines were as familiar to me as my own apartment. That realization stung more than I expected. My own life had become organized around someone else's pets. As I stood at the gate, memories arrived one after another. 3 summers earlier, I had canceled a weekend at the beach with college friends because my parents booked a cruise at the last minute. The year before that, I turned down tickets to a Broadway touring production because they wanted to visit relatives in Tennessee. Last Thanksgiving, I left dinner with coworkers early so I could drive 40 miles to feed the dogs after their flight home was delayed. Every time I said yes, they thanked me warmly, hugged me, and promised they would make it up to me someday. He never asked when that someday would come. He simply believed that helping family was what good daughters did. My phone buzzed with a message from my manager asking whether I had reached the airport safely. He looked at the screen for several seconds before locking it again. I believed I was already focused on the presentation we would give the next morning. My parents believed I would be driving back to their house before sunset. It amazed me that 2 completely different futures depended on the same answer. Emily, my mother continued, your father already packed the car, we are leaving in 2 hours. She said it as though the decision had been made for everyone involved. He realized she had never asked whether I was available. She had only informed me of the schedule after everything else was arranged. My calendar had simply been the final piece expected to fall into place. He rested my hand on the handle of my suitcase and looked once more through the large windows toward the aircraft waiting outside. I had spent years believing sacrifice automatically meant love. Standing there, I began wondering whether love should also include respect. If the people closest to me never paused to consider my dreams before making plans for me, was that truly kindness, or had we all quietly accepted a pattern that no longer made sense? The boarding line continued moving forward while I remained at the edge of the gate, feeling as though my entire adult life had been leading to a choice much larger than one missed flight. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, and people who had been waiting only moments earlier disappeared down the jet bridge one by one. My mother was still on the phone, completely certain that I would eventually say the same thing I had always said. Do not worry. He will take care of it. Instead, I stood there watching the line grow shorter while my heartbeat seemed louder than the voices around me. Emily, she said again, are you listening? Yes, I answered quietly. I am listening. My father finally spoke from somewhere in the background. His voice sounded calm, almost cheerful. Your mother said you are already at the airport. You can change the ticket. We will reimburse the fee. It was such a simple sentence, yet something inside me shifted. Neither of them had asked what the trip meant to me. They did not ask whether I had prepared for months, whether my team depended on me, or whether this opportunity might change my career. Their first solution was simply to cancel my plans because that had always been the easiest answer. I rested my suitcase beside one of the large windows overlooking the runway. The airplane waited in the afternoon sunlight, ready to carry hundreds of people toward meetings, vacations, reunions, and new beginnings. I wondered how many of them had spent years putting their own dreams behind everyone else's expectations. A gate agent smiled politely as she walked past and reminded me that boarding would close in just a few minutes. He thanked her, but I remained exactly where I was. My mind wandered back to dozens of ordinary moments that had never seemed important until now. He remembered leaving a birthday dinner early because my parents extended a weekend getaway without asking me first. He remembered using vacation days from work so they could attend a golf tournament 3 states away. He remembered waking before sunrise on snowy winter mornings to drive across town because one of the dogs refused breakfast unless someone familiar was nearby. None of those decisions had felt dramatic at the time. Each one seemed small enough to ignore. Looking back, they formed a pattern that stretched across nearly every year of my adult life. My apartment reflected that pattern too. Unfinished books sat on my coffee table because weekends often disappeared unexpectedly. A travel brochure for a national park remained pinned to my refrigerator after 3 summers because every planned trip somehow turned into another favor. Friends had gradually stopped asking whether I was available because my answer was usually uncertain. They never complained, but invitations became less frequent. Opportunities quietly disappeared while I convinced myself I was simply being dependable. "Emily," my mother interrupted my thoughts, "we really need you." I looked at the families gathered near the gate and realized something I had never admitted before. My parents did not truly need me. They needed the version of me who never questioned their assumptions. There was a difference. Healthy dogs could be cared for by neighbors, trusted friends, or professional pet sitters. My career opportunity, however, belonged only to me. If I walked away from it, no one else could reclaim it on my behalf. Another announcement confirmed that the aircraft door would soon close. I wrapped my fingers around the handle of my suitcase and took a slow breath. For years I believed saying yes kept peace inside my family. Standing in that airport, I began to wonder whether constant peace purchased with only one person's sacrifices was never really peace at all. It was simply a habit that everyone had learned to expect, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer certain I wanted to continue living by it. My mother remained silent for several long seconds, as though she could not believe I had not already promised to turn around. I could almost picture her standing in the kitchen with the cordless phone pressed against her ear, my father loading suitcases into the back of their SUV while Bailey, Charlie, and Daisy wandered around the living room without any idea that they had suddenly become the center of a family conflict. Finally she spoke again, her voice softer than before but carrying the same quiet certainty. "Emily, we have always counted on you." Those words settled over me more heavily than any accusation could have. She was right. They had counted on me for years, not because I was the only person who could help, but because I was the person least likely to say no. I glanced once more toward the gate where only a handful of passengers remained. A flight attendant scanned boarding passes with practiced efficiency while another employee prepared to close the aircraft door. I realized that every minute I spent standing there made the decision for me unless I acted. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a text message from my coworker Melissa. She wrote that everyone was already gathering in Seattle for dinner and hoped my flight would arrive on time because the executive team wanted to meet the participants the following morning. Reading her message reminded me that people outside my family believed I had a future worth investing in. They had trusted me with responsibility because of my work, not because I happened to be available whenever someone else's plans changed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and remembered another conversation from several months earlier. During my annual performance review, my manager had smiled and said I needed to stop declining opportunities simply because they disrupted my personal schedule. He almost laughed at the memory because he had no idea my personal schedule rarely belonged to me in the first place. Whenever I requested vacation, I quietly checked whether my parents had already mentioned an upcoming trip. Whenever friends suggested a weekend getaway, I hesitated until I knew my parents did not need me. Without realizing it, I had built my entire calendar around avoiding the possibility of disappointing them. Standing in that airport finally allowed me to see the pattern clearly. It had never been one dramatic sacrifice. It had been hundreds of ordinary ones, each small enough to excuse on its own. Together they had shaped the life I was living. "Emily," my father said after taking the phone, "your mother is upset because she thought this was already taken care of." His words were calm, almost practical. "We already paid for the cabin. We cannot cancel now." He looked out at the airplane resting beneath the afternoon sun and quietly wondered why the cost of their reservation seemed more important than the years I had spent preparing for this opportunity. Neither of my parents sounded cruel. They sounded completely convinced that my plans should naturally move aside for theirs. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase and slowly stepped toward the boarding line. My heart pounded with every step, not because I was afraid of flying, but because I knew I was walking toward a version of myself my parents had never expected to meet. Whatever would happen next, the familiar pattern that had quietly guided our family for so many years was about to change, and deep inside I understood that some changes begin with nothing more dramatic than taking one steady step forward instead of turning around. The gate agent smiled as I handed over my boarding pass. The scanner gave a soft chime, and for a brief second I simply stood there, almost expecting someone to stop me. No one did. I thanked her, stepped onto the jet bridge, and silenced my phone before taking my seat by the window. As the aircraft slowly pushed away from the terminal, I looked out across the runway, feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty that was impossible to separate. I had not argued with my parents. I had not raised my voice or accused them of being unfair. I had simply chosen to keep a promise I had made to myself long before they called. Even so, the decision felt strangely unfamiliar because I had spent so many years placing my own plans second. Once we reached cruising altitude, I turned my phone back on briefly while the aircraft's wireless service connected. Se verá el new. Messages appeared almost immediately. My mother had left 2 voicemails. My father had sent a short text asking me to call when I landed. There was also a message from Melissa reminding everyone about breakfast before the first leadership session. Reading her cheerful note brought an unexpected smile to my face. Somewhere ahead of me, people were preparing to welcome me because they believed I belonged there. That feeling was both comforting and surprisingly emotional. When the plane landed in Seattle later that evening, the cool Pacific Northwest air greeted me as I stepped outside the airport. Melissa waved from the hotel shuttle with 2 coworkers I had only met through video meetings. They greeted me warmly, asked about my flight, and immediately began talking about the week ahead. No one questioned whether I deserved to be there. No one suggested I should have stayed home. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen for my abilities rather than my availability. The following morning began early. Our group gathered in a bright conference room overlooking the city skyline. Senior leaders spoke about strategy, teamwork, and preparing for future opportunities within the company. I filled pages of notes, asked thoughtful questions, and found myself participating more confidently than I expected. During a break, one executive thanked me for an idea I shared during a discussion. It was a small moment, but it reminded me that every opportunity one accepted had the potential to open another door. As I turned around at the airport, I never would have experienced any of it. During lunch, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. His message was brief. He wrote that they had found a professional pet sitter through a recommendation from one of their neighbors. Everything was going well, and the dogs were settling in nicely. I read the message twice before placing the phone back into my bag. A strange mix of emotions settled over me. I was genuinely relieved the dogs were doing well, but I could not ignore the quiet truth hidden inside his words. A solution had existed all along. It simply had never been explored because relying on me had always been easier. That realization stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. As the leadership sessions continued, I listened more carefully than ever, not only to the speakers but also to my own thoughts. Boundaries, I realized, were rarely built through dramatic confrontations. More often, they began with one calm decision followed by the willingness to let other people solve problems they were fully capable of solving themselves. By the time I returned to my hotel room that evening, I felt tired in the best possible way. I had spent an entire day investing in my future instead of apologizing for having one, and for the first time in years, that no longer felt selfish. It simply felt right. The remainder of the week passed more quickly than I expected. Each morning began with workshops, group discussions, and practical exercises that challenged the way I approached leadership. Instead of worrying about whether someone else needed me somewhere else, I focused entirely on the work in front of me. The change felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, but with every passing day it became easier to believe that my own goals deserved the same care and attention I had always given everyone else's. During one afternoon session, our instructor asked each participant to describe a difficult decision that had shaped their personal growth. As my coworkers shared stories about career changes, family responsibilities, and unexpected setbacks, I realized I was not the only person who had struggled to balance loyalty with self-respect. When my turn came, I did not mention the phone call from the airport or my parents' vacation. Instead, I simply said that I was learning the difference between helping people and carrying responsibilities that were never truly mine. Several people nodded with quiet understanding. No one asked for further explanation. Somehow that brief conversation stayed with me long after the session ended. On the final evening, our company hosted a dinner overlooking Elliott Bay. The city lights reflected across the water while conversations drifted easily from one table to another. Melissa sat beside me and smiled as she raised her glass of sparkling water. She told me she had noticed a difference in my confidence throughout the week. He laughed softly and admitted I felt different too. She asked whether I had finally started believing I deserved opportunities instead of apologizing for them. The question caught me by surprise because it touched something I had only recently begun to recognize. I realized I had spent years asking permission to build my own life, even when no permission should have been necessary. The following morning I boarded my flight home with a notebook full of ideas and a quiet sense of accomplishment. When the plane landed in Columbus, I turned my phone on as passengers slowly gathered their belongings. Several messages appeared immediately. My father had sent a simple text thanking me for recommending that neighborhood pet sitting service, even though I had never actually recommended one. Apparently the neighbor who helped them had introduced them to a reliable caregiver who handled everything professionally. My mother had not written anything at all. He slipped the phone into my purse without replying immediately. As I collected my suitcase from baggage claim, I noticed how different I felt compared with the woman who had stood in the same airport only days earlier. Nothing dramatic had happened. My family had not fallen apart. The dogs had been cared for. My parents had enjoyed their vacation. My career opportunity had gone well. The world had continued moving exactly as it always had. The only real change was inside me. Driving home beneath the familiar Ohio sky, I thought about the countless times I had rushed to solve problems before anyone else even attempted to solve them. This time I had stepped back, and other people had discovered they were more capable than they believed. That lesson applied to far more than pet care. It applied to relationships, expectations, and the invisible habits families develop over many years. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I knew the hardest conversation still waited ahead. Returning from Seattle had been easy. Returning to the old family dynamic without slipping back into familiar patterns would require something far more difficult. It would require consistency. For the first time, however, I believed I was ready for that challenge because I was no longer trying to become a different daughter. I was simply learning how to be myself without carrying responsibilities that belonged to someone else. The first few days after returning home felt quieter than I expected. My parents did not call to ask for favors, and I resisted the urge to fill the silence myself. In the past, I would have driven over with groceries, checked on the dogs, or found some small excuse to make everything feel normal again. This time I stayed with my routine. I went to work, unpacked my suitcase, watered the plants in my apartment, and finally finished the novel that had been sitting untouched on my coffee table for months. Those ordinary moments felt surprisingly meaningful because they belonged entirely to me. On Thursday evening my phone finally rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. He answered with a warm greeting, and after a few minutes of casual conversation about the weather and my trip, he cleared his throat. I asked whether I could come over Saturday morning because the garage needed organizing before winter. There was nothing urgent about the request. I simply assumed I would spend my weekend helping, just as I always had. He opened my calendar before answering. For the first time in years, it already contained plans that mattered to me. Melissa had invited me to a networking event with several colleagues, followed by lunch with friends I had not seen in months. He thanked my father for asking and explained that I already had commitments. There was a brief silence before he responded. I sounded surprised more than upset. I asked whether my plans could be moved to Sunday instead. He smiled even though he could not see me. He calmly explained that my weekend had been scheduled for weeks and that perhaps he could ask one of his neighbors or tackle the garage over several afternoons instead of all at once. I did not argue. I simply said he would think about it before ending the call. When the conversation finished, I noticed something remarkable. My heart was not racing. He did not feel guilty. He did not spend the next hour rehearsing apologies in my mind. He had answered honestly, respectfully, and without anger. The world had not fallen apart. Saturday arrived with bright autumn sunshine. He met my co-workers downtown, attended the networking event, exchanged ideas with people from different departments, and laughed more than I had in weeks. During lunch, one friend asked what had changed because I seemed more relaxed than usual. He thought about the question before answering. He told her I had finally started treating my own time as something valuable instead of something available. She nodded thoughtfully and admitted she had learned the same lesson after years of trying to please everyone around her. Hearing someone else describe a similar experience reminded me that healthy boundaries were not acts of rejection. They were acts of balance. That evening my father sent a photograph of the cleaned garage. The shelves were organized, old boxes had been donated, and everything looked neat. His message was simple. He wrote that one of the neighbors had spent 2 hours helping and that they enjoyed catching up while they worked. He looked at the picture for a long moment before smiling. The task had been completed without me, just as the dogs had been cared for without me. And that assumption quietly disappeared. Perhaps my parents had never lacked options. Perhaps they had simply grown accustomed to choosing the easiest one. As I set my phone aside and looked around my apartment, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. The space seemed brighter, not because anything had changed inside the room, but because I was finally beginning to understand that saying no to one expectation had allowed me to start saying yes to my own life, one ordinary day at a time. Nearly 3 weeks passed before my mother called again. This time her voice sounded different. There was no immediate request waiting behind a hurried greeting, no carefully arranged plan that expected me to rearrange my schedule. She simply asked whether I would like to come over for Sunday dinner if I happened to be free. Those last 4 words caught my attention more than anything else she said. If I happened to be free. I thanked her for the invitation, checked my calendar, and realized I genuinely had the afternoon available. Instead of feeling obligated, I found myself looking forward to seeing them because the choice finally felt like mine. On Sunday I drove to the familiar house where I had spent my childhood. The maple tree in the front yard had already begun turning brilliant shades of orange and gold. As I walked toward the porch, Bailey barked happily through the front window while Charlie and Daisy followed close behind, their tails wagging with the same excitement they had always shown whenever I visited. He knelt to greet them before stepping inside, and for the first time I noticed something that would have escaped me only a month earlier. Near the kitchen door hung a framed schedule listing feeding times, medications, emergency contacts, and the name of the professional pet sitting service my parents had recently hired. It was simple, organized, and practical. My mother noticed me looking at it and smiled. She admitted that the service had worked out much better than she expected. The dogs had adjusted quickly, and the sitter even sent daily photographs while my parents were away. There was no embarrassment in her voice, only quiet honesty. During dinner we talked about ordinary things. My trip to Seattle. My father's vegetable garden. My mother's new recipe for apple crisp. The conversation flowed naturally because no one was negotiating favors or managing expectations. After we finished eating, my father invited me onto the back porch while my mother cleared the table. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower hummed softly through the neighborhood. My father leaned against the porch railing for a long moment before speaking. He admitted that after I left for Seattle, he had been frustrated at first because everything felt unfamiliar. Then the neighbor introduced him to the pet sitting service, and he realized there had been several options available all along. He looked at me with a thoughtful expression I had not seen before and quietly said that perhaps they had relied on me too often simply because I'd become comfortable. He did not offer a dramatic apology, and I did not expect one. His willingness to acknowledge the pattern mattered more than perfectly chosen words. A few minutes later my mother joined us outside with 3 mugs of hot cider. She sat beside me and gently placed one hand over mine. She admitted she had always believed asking family for help was a sign of closeness, but somewhere along the way she had stopped asking and started assuming. She told me she never intended to make me feel as though my own life mattered less than theirs. I believed her. Intentions do not erase the impact of our actions, but honest reflection can become the beginning of meaningful change. As the afternoon sun settled behind the trees, we watched the dogs chase one another across the backyard without anyone discussing future trips or responsibilities. The silence felt comfortable rather than uncertain. Driving home later that evening, I realized healing had not come from winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It had begun when each of us became willing to see the situation from a perspective we had ignored for far too long, and that quiet shift made every mile of the drive home feel lighter than the one before. Several months passed before I fully understood how much our family had changed. The difference did not appear in one dramatic conversation or a single unforgettable moment. It revealed itself through small, ordinary experiences that once would have gone unnoticed. My parents began calling before making plans instead of after making them. They asked whether I was available instead of assuming I would be. Sometimes I accepted their invitations, and sometimes I already had other commitments. Each answer was received with the same simple response. They thanked me for letting them know. That quiet respect meant more than any apology ever could. My own life continued moving forward in ways I had once imagined but never truly believed were possible. The leadership program led to new responsibilities at work, and several months later my manager invited me into his office to offer me the promotion we had discussed in Seattle. As he shook my hand, I thought back to the airport gate where I had almost walked away from that opportunity. As I turned around that day, I would probably have convinced myself it was only one missed trip. Looking at everything that followed, I finally understood that some decisions become turning points not because they seem extraordinary at the time, but because they quietly change the direction of every step that comes afterward. My apartment slowly reflected those changes as well. The stack of unread books on my coffee table grew smaller because I finally had evenings to enjoy them. I planned weekend trips without worrying that I might need to cancel at the last minute. Friends began inviting me out more often because they knew I was no longer living on permanent standby. Even the simple act of writing plans on my calendar felt different. The empty spaces no longer represented obligations waiting to appear. They represented time that belonged to me unless I freely chose to share it. One crisp Saturday afternoon I stopped by my parents' house after visiting a nearby farmer's market. My mother greeted me with a warm hug while my father waved from the backyard, where he was repairing a section of the fence. Bailey, Charlie, and Daisy ran happily across the lawn before returning to chase one another through the fallen leaves. Near the kitchen door, the pet sitting schedule still hung neatly in its frame. He smiled when I noticed several new names written beneath the original caregiver. My parents had built a small list of trusted people instead of depending on only one person. Without realizing it, they had created the flexibility our family had been missing for years. As we shared coffee on the back porch, my father looked toward the yard and quietly admitted something that stayed with me long after I drove home. He said that becoming a parent sometimes makes it easy to forget that children eventually become adults with lives just as full and meaningful as their own. My mother nodded in agreement and gently squeezed my hand. No long speeches followed. None were needed. Their actions over the previous months had already spoken more clearly than words. Driving home beneath a sky painted with the colors of late autumn, I realized I had never wanted distance from my family. I had only wanted room to grow without feeling guilty for doing so. Loving the people who raised me did not require abandoning the person I was becoming. In fact, the healthiest version of our relationship began only after I stopped confusing endless sacrifice with unconditional love. Looking back now, I no longer remember that airport phone call as the day I disappointed my parents. I remember it as the day I finally trusted myself enough to believe that my dreams deserved a place beside the people I loved, not underneath them, and that simple change allowed all of us to become a stronger family than we had ever been before.